Let's do a very ridiculous case. Let's take a film that is getting some praise as the greatest movie ever made, especially with it reaching the number one spot of the Sight and Sound list. Yes, I'm talking about Jeanne Dielman, the slow-paced yet intense 3.5 hour art house film. Now, what about a hated horror film? A 4.4 on IMDb? An audience score of 9% on Rotten Tomatoes, and a 2.6 on Letterboxd. That film is Tobe Hooper's swan song, and a film made in United Arab Emirates of all places. Djinn. Well, at least I'm going to be talking about the director's cut, which is vastly superior. So, why the hell would I lump these two together? Well, these are two films that explore the same very specific themes, but done through a different method. Greetings, and welcome to the Tatted Didactic. I'm your host, Pretentious Hipster, and this will be my first episode, and I've chose to do something quite risky. I am someone studying film theory, but I hate academic jargon. I have watched over 10,000 films as well. I try to make my taste as eclectic as possible, which also means I'll have plenty of hot takes as I try to view films through their strengths as opposed to having a more objective approach when it comes to reviewing stuff. I hope this episode will prove it. For a quick summary, Jeanne Dielman is a more avant-garde film following 3 days of a single mother's life. She's reduced to doing chores all the time, which we see in every single slow-paced detail, having very little to no hobbies of her own and doing sex work for the finances. In Djinn, it follows a couple moving to the United Arab Emirates from America to start their lives over. And well, basically a bunch of J-horror level stuff starts happening, with tons of jump scares, gothic horror style moods, over the top use of colors and saturation, and an overall maximalist horror vibe. I have noticed that the theme for both films is that they explore how motherhood can turn into a prison. But what makes this weirder is not only them exploring an overarching theme like that, but there are a lot of intricacies that they both share. The only major difference is that Jeanne Dielman shows this prison eternally, while Djinn shows it externally. Aside from that aspect, the vibe of the films, and a few details, the content of these films are practically the same. Let's begin by exploring the prison in Jeanne Dielman. It's simply her routine, which almost comes across as hard labor. It includes scenes such as shining her son's shoes, cooking, eating quietly with her son, only shopping for the essentials, and doing the sex work. We see most of these in their entirety, except for said sex work, which I'll explore later on, but her routine is at the point where she can start boiling some potatoes for dinner, have a client come in, and then be done in time to drain said potatoes. Yeah, it's at that level. This is one of the earliest scenes in the film, and it brilliantly establishes what she goes through. It becomes even more depressing when you look at her son. During the first dinner, we see both of them eating, with her asking him to stop reading his book, and we assume a conversation is going to start. But alas, they just eat in silence. The most effective scene of this is after dinner on the second day. She's sitting on the table while her son goes on the couch to read. They both are separated by a partial wall, and with this there is the brown wall on her side and this ugly wallpaper on her son's side. With this, just one simple conversation a day, which is usually right before bedtime, or maybe a tiny bit of small talk during dinner, usually in cold and clinical ways, on top of shining his shoes, it's like her son got reduced into simply a chore. Through a more technical standpoint, it is the look of the rooms that does a fantastic job at giving that prison sort of feel. There is a great use of liminal space in this way before it was cool to do so. When she cooks in the kitchen, almost everything has the same shade of yellow. There are only a few minor cleaning products, some stuff sitting in the front of the window, the prep table, and the drapes. It does feel like someone is trying to break out of this prison. The bathroom was another great example too. There is that bluish green sort of pattern on the side of the wall, and the side of the tub that felt like a Jackson Pollock painting. The back and front walls have this standard white tiles, but the thing is, that bluish green pattern is also at the front, but just around the faucet. It's such a baffling choice in interior design that it gives an uneasy feeling. kinda like the prison that didn't have any proper upkeep. Finally, the cinematography is mind-blowing in one simple way. During nighttime in the living room, there are outdoor lights shining into the house, and they move in a pattern that almost feels like they were searchlights. It's a sign that she can't escape. Now, how does Djinn show this? They use the classical horror trope to first explain the region's origin story. A Djinn possesses a newborn, and shortly after an exorcism happens, and they move the baby as far away as possible. Of course, the Djinn hated that, and what this turns into is the future prison of motherhood. As they move to the UAE, Khalid's family drives them to their new home, and he has new jobs lined up for him as well. They have trouble finding it because when they reach a tunnel, there is a relentless amount of fog, which of course leads to a jump scare of someone on the road. They are completely lost and can't find where the apartment complex is, which leads to a simple yet effective way to show this. Khalid is outside looking for the body, the apartment, or well, anything. They use scattered and frantic editing of him looking around, and only at the right time, he sees something in the distance. An apartment complex, which looks as dystopian as something that the Dread remake would have, is in the distance. As they enter inside, the place looks completely abandoned except for the front desk employee who later escorts them to their new room. This is where the truly effective liminal space lies ahead. Sure, the place looks bougie, but the monochrome look is everywhere. All the floors look the same, and despite the fancy symmetrical pattern that even includes smaller statues, it's basically the type of hallway that is begging to have the trope of the light slowly turning off towards a character, which of course happens in this film. This film has an aggressive use of both obvious symbolism and literal factors that drive Salma towards the prison. When the family's touring with them, the mother's already pressuring them to have children because of the spare bedroom. As they leave, there is a fountain in the front of the building which shows an open clam with 3 pearls and a phallic symbol shooting out of water. And then, they don't mess around. Khaled's family immediately dies, and then he's told to go change and go to work before even settling in, finding out that the work consists of long hours and a very long drive, making sure that he will almost spend no time with Samala. When she does walk just a little beyond the statue, there are a group of wild dogs barking at her and begin to chase her to try to kill her. She's trapped in the most barren and liminal apartment complex in the most literal way possible. To take it a step further, there's a separation with her and Khaled, even beyond his long hours. In 2 scenes, each of them meets a woman neighbor that is clearly set up to be the homewrecker. She aggressively flirts with Khaled, and he's into her as easily as a fish is with a worm attached to a hook. With this separation, if he eventually leaves, then she would be in the most isolated prison of motherhood. It could be seen as a weird way to show this, as if he's not there then they can't have a child, but it makes sense when I cover the other points. Although one is realistic while the other is supernatural, the other connection is how they protect themselves from the prison of motherhood. How do they cope with the situation? With Jeanne Dielman, it reminds me of my 20s, which I'm sure is more commonplace now. There is this sort of uncomfortably apathetic yet safe bubble. Of course, it does have a long-lasting effect on you, sometimes even resulting in trauma. The difference is the people I'm mentioning are usually there by self-created circumstances, whereas for her, this is an unavoidable situation. This might result in even more trauma for her. She does try to break this routine with various outdoor activities. The problem is that there's a lot of emptiness to it. A great example was her going to the cafe. Normally that's a great way to relax, perhaps having a conversation with a friend. The brilliant part of this was the production design, where even something like a cafe can give you the off vibe that you get from a liminal space. Everything is too monochrome. Aside from a very small number of plants, everything else is brown. It even comes down to the coffee mug and the plate being the same color. The break does slowly happen with this in the sex work. You start seeing her screw up some of the chores, like dropping a utensil when she polishes them, or dinner being made too late. This all culminates into something very interesting. A very subtle way that she has OCD, her way to control the stress basically. But let's consider this a tease for later on. With Djinn, The prison is seen externally. Despite them losing a child in the past, which we find out during a fight, Khalid tells Samala that they'll have kids soon again regardless. As she's left alone when he goes to work, this is where the external factors of that prison show. What may or may not be the Djinn keeps crawling around throughout the apartment, taunting her in ways that scream J-horror. Her crawling on the ceiling, walking into the apartment which can only be viewed on the camera, but is not actually there. Jump scares with birds hitting windows that look like a hand for a split second. They hit her with everything. Externally, this becomes a prison for her. Her sense of protection during all this is her newfound Islamic faith. Religion is in a sense of comfort for many, including her. It helps them to get out of situations and give them the answer they need. In this case, the family gives her trinkets to protect her from evil. We can go back to the scene where the Djinn tried to get in and you could see it through the camera, but she couldn't do anything. Samala obviously tells the front desk employee to come in and search the place. While he does so, he manages to find said trinket and disposes of it, giving that Djinn full freedom. When all goes to hell, she wears a hijab and does a prayer to protect herself. Unfortunately, the Djinn has full power at this point, so it was all for naught. Both films also reach their point of resistance and eventual defiance. The difference is when they happen, and how they happen through a more positive versus negative approach. With Jeanne Dielman, there's the first sign when she goes shopping during the second day. One of her usual stores that she visits is closed, and eventually the closing gate is the monochrome gray color. While she waits, she window shops at the next store, and that store had some more colors for once. It was tempting her to shop for more wants rather than needs. Could it finally be that wake-up call? And as a tidbit, if you do watch the film, look at the corner during the scene. There's a child that is clearly staring at the camera, which I found to be funny. However, there is a scene involving coffee which reveals her OCD. What she uses to cope, but also what she uses to resist the prison. For once, she has time to spare and doesn't know how to relax. She tries to make herself a cup of coffee, but she panics and throws it out. She can't bear the thought of relaxing, as enticing as that coffee is. This is when she gives it another chance. However, when she does so, she takes sugar cubes and aligns them in an organized way. A very common way to show OCD. She lost so much control of her life by the prison of routine that she developed it to try to bring the control in her life. Trying to relax with the coffee was that form of exposure therapy. Yes, it's an almost positive approach to it, but then it does get a bit too much for her, so she found a new chore of polishing everything in a cabinet. She then has no choice but to sit and realizes that this accomplishes nothing. This scene of rebellion then shows up. When she babysits, she ignores some of the cries so that she can focus on eating her sandwich. Yet another form of exposure therapy. She then goes for what therapists always want you to have: boundaries and self-care. She wants to fix the button on one of her outfits and tries to find it in a shopping spree, in stores that are full of colors. There's a scene that's uplifting, as when she talks to an employee during this, she smiles for the first time. Just that simple act of emotion like this was that act of defiance. The finale is when this all culminates to the extreme, her breaking point. She has another client. When they usually show the scenes with the clients, we see him come in and then both of them walk towards the bedroom. But the clever thing is what they do with the camera. It's positioned at a height that her head is cut off. This was a clever way of showing that it is now going to be treated as an object. However, this time we see her in the bedroom preparing for it. We don't see her as an object with a disconnect. It actually gets more disturbing. It cuts to the sex scene itself, and she is basically positioned like a sex doll with her arms bent and her looking up to the ceiling. To call this sex scene cold and clinical is an understatement. And through the use of showing it explicitly for you to see how the sex actually is, was a wake-up call for the audience. It is also the scene where, despite her act of defiance, she is forced back into the prison. She knows though that she can't go back into it, and this is when she breaks down completely. If you know what happens, you most definitely remember it. She reaches the point of no return. This then ends with a scene in the dining room where we once again see the searchlights. It shows that despite that act, she is still trapped, and because she is looking in the direction of those lights, she is facing it head on. With Djinn, although in the film it's a big reveal near the end, it happens before the time the film takes place. This is also one of the big reasons why the director's cut is vastly superior. The theatrical version shows this early on, but it's so much more suitable to make this a twist. Earlier in the film, the Djinn transforms into the mother, and berates her for what she has done to a baby. This is also further teased during a ghost interaction where a carriage randomly shows up in a room with a bunch of pearls rolling towards her, the same as in that clam fountain. It then leads to a flashback when you see the baby. The baby was a monster. Khaled is the baby that was taken away at the beginning. So, Smala ended up killing the baby. This was her breaking point. Her resistance to ensure that she won't enter that prison of motherhood. The baby being the monster can be seen as symbolic of what the motherhood means to her. Perhaps she wasn't ready for it, or perhaps never wanted kids in the first place. That's why the baby didn't look human. The director's cut ending of this shows the finale of the prison for Samala. She ends up getting killed by falling down the building's top floor, despite Khaled trying to save her. As she has died in a place that she was forced to go to and was isolated, she too is now forever in that prison. So the big question is, what about the Djinn? Turns out that was the homewrecker and that was Khalid's mother. So, why isn't it a prison for her? Of course, first there are every horror trope being played out during the segment, which makes for a fun experience, and it culminates into Khalid being dragged by a bunch of Djinn into an elevator, forever making him one of them. That's why I think there's a disconnect in why this wasn't a prison. They are not a family in a literal sense, but rather trying to increase their numbers. This is shown in a party that the mother invites the couple into, where you see tons of people in there, obviously implying that they're the Djinn as well. They are not a family in a literal sense then. Well, this brings the first episode to an end. I hope this analysis made sense. I will be doing more comparing two film episodes like these, but I also want to analyze single films, providing a hot take to the point of trying to reclaim a film, or doing some simple primers and lists. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll come back for the next episode.